Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the number one absolute best way to build an Alzheimer's resistant brain. I think most people would agree that getting severe dementia like Alzheimer's is one of the most terrifying prospects we can face, to lose our mind, to lose who we are. But we also need to understand that some level of forgetting is perfectly normal and even good for us. So we have to understand the difference between what's normal and what's a disease and make sure that we never get to the disease part. So some things like you go into the kitchen or you go into the garage and you're supposed to get something and all of a sudden your mind is blank. You have no idea why you went in there, or you can't remember where you put your car keys or where you put your coat or whatever. And some of these things are perfectly normal. They tend to increase with age, but it's still not necessarily a bad thing. What's really bad is when it progresses, and in the severe stages where we can't remember relatives, where we can't remember familiar things like our car or the drive home or the house we live in. Now that is the disease part that we definitely never want to get to. But to start understanding why some aspects of forgetting are normal, I want to talk about the brain life cycle. And this is absolutely fascinating to me, that we start off at conception and we have one cell, and then this cell starts dividing. And within a couple of weeks, we start getting the first structures of the brain. And then by the time we're born, we actually have 100 billion brain cells, which is the largest number of cells that we will ever have in our life. Much, much more brain cells than as an adult. And at the time of birth, we have a lot of neurons, we have a lot of brain cells, but we have very few connections between them. They haven't learned to talk to each other and communicate and signal yet. And this is the difference between the gray matter of the brain and the white matter. So when you're born, the gray matter is the brain cells. You have a lot of that. But the white matter, that's like the cabling, that's like the insulated wires between the brain cells. And we don't have a lot of those at birth. But that is soon to change, because between birth and the age of 2 years, you start making synapses. And you're making 1.8 million synapses, not per day, not per hour, but every second you make 1.8 million new synapses from roughly age 0 to age 2. So when you're 2 years old, now you have 1,000 trillion synapses in your brain, all these different connections. And this number is actually twice as big as you're going to have when you're an adult. And what's interesting is that this is actually a massive overproduction. It's way, way, way more synapses than you're ever going to need. But it's an overproduction on purpose. So it's like you're building out this network for every possibility that could ever come up, so that you have the synapses just in case, and then you're going to start organizing them later. Another thing that we need to understand is that this is genetically determined. That yes, these synapses are driven by your experience, by your sensory and motor experience, by things you see and touch and hear and feel, and by the movement as you learn to move, but you don't have to do anything else. These synapses are going to be exploding no matter what, and it's genetically determined. And this is very different from later in life. And we have this massive overproduction of synapses because this gets the brain ready for rapid learning and adaptation. So at this age, your brain is like a sponge. You're just absorbing everything at a massive rate. But then, once we've reached this maximum number at about age 2, now we start something called pruning. And this is where the principle of use it or lose it comes more into play, where your experience becomes more important than just your genetic determination. And From age 2 years old, you're still going to be making about 1 million synapses per second, but you're going to be pruning. You're going to get rid of about 1.6 million. So the ones that you use, you're going to build stronger. The ones that you don't, you're going to get rid of. And this pruning and this stabilization allows the brain to become more specialized and more energy efficient, because the brain is an energy hog as it is. So we need to make it run as effectively as possible. So this pruning and stabilization continues for many, many years, all the way through adolescence into adulthood. And there's one area in particular called the prefrontal cortex, which sits in the front of the brain. And it's responsible for impulse control and reasoning and most of the things that we associate with humanity and executive function and planning and things like that. And the curious thing about this part of the brain is that it is inhibitory. The vast majority, about 90% of what that portion of the brain does is it turns things off. So we have all these impulses to come in from our environment and from the body, but the frontal lobe turns off the vast majority. So in a sense, it decides for us what's important to pay attention to. And if we couldn't turn off and ignore most of the information coming to us, we would be absolutely overwhelmed by the massive flow of information that we're exposed to. And this portion of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it keeps developing and maturing and stabilizing all the way up to about age 25. And if you think about what it does, that it's responsible for impulse control, that means it has a lot to do with our safety, our ability to not take unnecessary risks, which we tend to do prior to that age. And this is the reason that you can't rent a car in the United States before age 25. So at age 25, that's basically the healthiest, the strongest, the best you're going to be in terms of brain health. And you have now developed a strong, efficient neural network. And then after age 25, now you're sort of on your own. And it's not as bad as it sounds. It just means that you're not going to have any new brain cells or any new synapses for free. Like when you're 2 years old, they just sprout no matter what. But once you hit 25, now it's going to be more about use it or lose it. Now, it's still possible for us to make new brain cells and new connections. So neurogenesis means to make new brain cells. That can still happen at any age. It's just not going to happen as easily as when we're babies. But that's still not really a big deal because it's not about the number of brain cells. We're going to have enough. It's more about how they're connecting. And synaptogenesis, meaning making new connections, that is very possible all the way throughout life. It means that we can still learn things. But again, it's just not going to happen spontaneously at the rate it did when we were babies. So the older we get, the slower this process is going to happen, but it's still going to take place. And it's going to be more and more driven by learning and experience. Another word for this reorganization and making and breaking connections is called neuroplasticity. And that simply means the brain can reorganize itself, which is necessary for learning. If you can learn something new at any age, that means that this process is still possible. So when it comes to the brain's ability to adapt and prioritize, the things we forget or remember tends to have to do with how useful they are. We keep useful memories, and we tend to forget things that are rarely used. We tend to forget things that have a low priority, or at least to us. So things like names, for example, different cultures put a different value on remembering names. I am pretty terrible with remembering names. If I just hear a name once, then I'm not going to remember it. But most people won't. And the people who remember names, they're the ones who put a priority on it, who repeat names to themselves. So I still know hundreds of people and I know their names. So it's not like I can't remember names. It's just that I don't make it a priority all the time. And so it goes not just with names, but people who remember things, it's usually because they make it a priority. And this selective ability allows the brain to focus and to save on resources, to not waste resources. And the people who can't make this selection, the people who have total recalls and photographic memories and who can't prioritize, they usually are not very healthy and happy. They usually have some sort of mental problem along with it. So all of the stuff in green here is relatively normal. Of course, it could get out of hand if we never can remember any of it. And when it really becomes a problem and where we don't want to allow it to go is when we're forgetting even the familiar, the friends, the family, where we live, when we forget even the really important stuff. And here's a key, when we can't remember even with repetition, no matter how many times we repeat it, then it's just not there. Now, I've noticed also with language, I'm trying to learn a few new languages just for fun and to make my brain active, but it takes a whole lot more repetition than it used to do when I was younger. And I can definitely still learn the language, but I have to immerse myself at a different level. So now you have a really good foundation to understand how to support the brain. And we're going to talk about what it needs. And this perspective is much more important than just getting a diagnosis, because once you get the diagnosis, it's usually too late. And all these things, this understanding is what we need to do beforehand to never get there. So the simple perspective we want to have is to give the body what it needs. And here we need to understand that the world, our environment that we have created has changed more in 50 years, in the last 50 years, than it has in the previous 50,000. So then the question there is, how has it changed and how is that affecting us? So what does the brain need? Well, it's really pretty simple. It needs energy. It's an energy hog. It uses a lot of energy. And it has sort of a leading role in the body, so it makes sure that it gets the energy first when it can. And then it needs stimulation. Use it or lose it. Its purpose is to process information. Most of that information comes from movement, and then it comes from a lot of specialized skills. So if we keep stimulating it, now it has a reason to stay strong. And to make energy, we need fuel, and that fuel is glucose and ketones. That's the only fuel the brain can use. And of course, in order to turn that into energy, we also need oxygen. And then while we're making energy, we're creating some waste products. So we also need a system to clean that up and get those waste products out of the brain and out of the body. So we're going to talk about some very specific things and why you want to do them. So keep in mind, and go back if you need to, at how those things we talk about, how they relate to these three different factors that the brain needs. One of the most important and overlooked things that we have to have for brain health is sleep. And most people don't really know why. They know if we don't sleep, we get tired and cranky, so that can't be good. But it's so much more than that. So 50% of your brain cells are the signaling cells that we talked about, the neurons. But 50% of cells are not neurons, they're glial cells. They are supportive cells, and you could call them the cleanup crew. So the glial cells go around and they clean up all this metabolic, all this cellular waste, molecule by molecule, and then they dump it into the CSF, into the cerebrospinal fluid, which is a watery substance that bathes and supports the brain, but also flows very slowly, and it connects to the body's vascular system, to the blood, and that way it can dump these waste products into the blood, and we can get rid of them through the liver and the bowel and the kidneys like everything else. Now, this cleanup is a really, really big deal, because one of the things that they can clean up is actually the beta amyloid and the tau proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's. And these junk proteins, they only develop because there's too much metabolic waste that creates inflammation, and there's an incomplete cleanup process. If the brain is allowed to clean itself out, then these things will probably never happen. But even after we have started accumulating some of these proteins, the beta amyloid and the tau proteins, a small amount can still be cleaned up and removed by this process. And here's just another example of how amazingly intelligent the body is, that these synapses shrink during sleep so that they become smaller. So there's more room for that CSF to flow through and flow better and eliminate waste better. In fact, that cleanup process works 10 times better during sleep than it does when we're awake. And that's why it's so critical that we get this quality sleep. And quality sleep means that we go through different sleep stages. And there's one called deep sleep, and this is where this cleanup process, this detox process, is the most efficient. But another sleep stage is super important for other things. Your REM sleep is very important for your mental health and for your stress levels. Because during your REM sleep is where you're processing a lot of what happened the day before. So you do a lot of pruning and strengthening. You are processing emotions. You're reformulating what these emotions means. You take the edge off them, if you will, and you're also performing memory consolidation. You're turning short-term memories into long-term memories. And one example of just how important this process is in people with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, their REM sleep is disrupted, and therefore they have persistent unprocessed emotional trauma. It stays with them. They just can't move through that. They can't take the edge off, and their lives are pretty much ruled by it. Next thing you want to do to support your body is to eat food. And a lot of you are going to say, well, no problem there, I eat food. But the question is, do you really? And in association with dementia, they have often quoted the Mediterranean diet as being very beneficial for brain health. And I'm not disputing that, but it's not about a label of some sort. The Mediterranean diet is just one area, the region where they have found people eat a certain good quality food and a good mix of natural foods. But it's not that, it's the quality of the food. So here are some things that are not food that people go and they buy and they eat a lot of these things, but they're not food. And these are things like sugar, white flour, and white oil. They are things like pesticides, GMO, and frankenfoods, things that we have just changed too much from its original state, and then our bodies don't recognize it. It doesn't have the value of what our body is looking for. So instead, food is meat, fish, and poultry, all of which they eat in the Mediterranean diet. Then you have vegetables, which preferably would be mostly low carb. But again, if you're metabolically healthy, you don't have to be very strict about that. But if you're diabetic, I think that they should be very low carb. And food also includes things like nuts and seeds, and they include mushrooms. They include healthy fat like extra virgin olive oil, butter, lard, tallow, any sort of fat that comes from nature that we haven't turned into a frankenfood. Now, here's the scary part. The average large food store has about 50,000 stock keeping units, 50,000 items on the shelves. And about 98 to 99% of those are not food. They fit into these categories that we talked about, whereas the real food is about 1 to 2%. And then if we go back and we compare the last 50 years to previous 50,000 years ago, they didn't have pesticides. They didn't have grain fed. So if we start talking about organic food, the way it's supposed to be on the planet, and if we talk about grass-fed, meaning animals eat what they're naturally supposed to eat, and we have pastured chickens, and all of the food is raised in its natural environment, now we're not even going to be close to 1%. So I just want to get it in perspective of how far we have strayed from what we used to be. And it doesn't mean that you should panic if you can't get everything organic and grass-fed. It just means start working your way there. Realize where we have gone, and then just do your best. The next way to support your brain is movement. And 90% of the signals that reach the brain, that is the stimulation for the brain, come from movement. And here, just about anything that you want to do is good for you. Walking, hiking, biking, rollerblading, weightlifting, yoga, Pilates, all of those are fantastic, and you want to do a lot of them. Anything low intensity that you can do for a long time, like hours, then that's what you would ideally do. Then you don't want to do a whole lot of medium to high intensity. So these are things like aerobics classes or spin classes. And it doesn't mean you can't do them. It just means you shouldn't do hours and hours, because that's too much. If it involves a lot of lactic acid and huffing and puffing, it's still good for you to a point, but hours and hours starts breaking you down, and it's not really supporting the body. And then you also want to fit in, if you can, if you're fit enough, you want to do short duration, high intensity interval training. And this would be seconds. So you can think about this as the low intensity. If you can and have the time, then you could do hours of that. The medium, you would do minutes, maybe 20, 30 minutes, but not every single day. And then the short duration, the high intensity, you would do for seconds. And think back to 50,000 years ago, your ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They would walk, they would climb, they would move a lot. They would probably put in 20, 30,000 steps. They would walk for hours. They would move all day long, pretty much. But they wouldn't do a whole lot of jogging. They wouldn't do a whole lot of spin classes or something where you huff and puff for 30, 40 minutes at a time. But then they would have a hunt, and they would chase something, or they would get chased, and that would only last for seconds. So this could be sprinting. It could be anything you do super high intensity that you could do for a short time, but you couldn't maintain it for minutes. So weightlifting here is in the low intensity, because some forms of weightlifting, like gardening, you could do for hours. But if you're in the gym and you lift something super heavy, now this could fit into the high intensity, because if you lift something really heavy, you could only do that for seconds. And the reason we would want to do some of all of these, but especially the top one and the bottom one, is that high intensity produces BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and human growth hormone. And I'll come back to these, but these are basically like miracle grow for the brain. You cannot make synapses. You cannot build new brain cells or connect them without these two hormones. And then you want to practice some form of stress control, because stress is an emergency. It breaks the body down, and it sends the blood flow away from the frontal lobe down to the more primitive reactive portions of the brain, in the brainstem, our reptilian brain, if you will. And there's lots and lots of different ways to do that. The more of them you can do, the more balanced you'll probably be. So things like meditation and just breathing, relaxation techniques. There are some tools that I'll put a link down below called Heart Math and Brain Tap. They can be excellent to help you monitor how you're doing. And then, like we just talked about, the exercise is a fantastic form of stress control, because it's the #1 stimulation for the frontal lobe that allows us to turn stress off. And some other great things, if you have the possibility, is singing. Sing in a choir, sing in the shower, do some karaoke at home. Singing is very, very powerful stress relief. Socializing, spend some time, go to a club with family and friends. All of this is very good for your stress. And the reason that we want to pay some attention and to do some of these exercises, even if we don't feel stressed, is that we want to realize stress has momentum. That once you get a stress response, if you sit in traffic, if you get angry or for some reason, now that stress has a momentum. It tends to go on. You tend to stay in that state until something else happens. So if you don't have a way to break that pattern for hours, then you're going to be stressed for hours. It's going to go down very, very slowly. Whereas if you can do something like we talked about, then that's a pattern interrupt. You can reset, you can get back to base level in a couple of minutes instead of waiting several hours. And then the more that you practice these things, the more you train your brain to reset, the better it's going to be at it, and the more it's going to be able to do it automatically. And the next thing that you want to do is to never stop learning. Always keep learning new things. Challenge yourself, stimulate yourself. One little tool that I like is called Duolingo. It has most of the popular languages in the world, and you can download an app on your phone and you can learn these things for free. Besides languages, you could start new form of art, you could start painting, you could start woodworking, anything that you enjoy. You could do crossword puzzles, you could do Sudoku, mind games, they're all good. Basically, any new skill that you learn is going to build your brain. It's going to increase the complexity of your neural network. And why is this so important? Because the more complexity you have, the more wired your brain is, the more alternatives your brain has to rewire itself. So if you start getting some of those traffic jams, some of those beta amyloid plaques, but you have more complexity, now it means that the brain can reroute that information and figure it out anyway. So just knowing a second language really well, really fluently, reduces your risk of dementia by 50%. So the more of these skills that you can add, the better off you're going to be, the more you're going to reduce your risk. But here's the problem. A lot of people will hear this first when it comes to dementia. When they say stay active, stimulate yourself, they're talking mostly about keeping your mind active. And this is all great. Like I said, it's going to increase the complexity of your neural network. But there's a big but here, that if you don't have healthy neurons, if you don't have a good energy supply, if you don't control your degree of inflammation, and most importantly, if you don't do the exercise to stimulate your brain to physiological health and strength, and you don't get these miracle grow hormones, the BDNF and the human growth hormone, then all of this is going to fall flat. You're going to be doing these things, but they're not going to connect. They're not going to create new synapses and new neural networks. So it's almost like, yes, these are great, but almost like don't waste your time with these if you don't also stay physically active and eat right. So the way to really support your body and your brain is to respect natural law. Realize what your body was built for. Realize how the world has changed in the last 50 years versus the last 50,000. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate conveniences. I appreciate technology. But then we have to be selective and we have to adapt and adjust so that we can still expose our bodies to the conditions that we had before all these conveniences were here. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.